6 months had passed since that life-changing day at Riverside Elementary. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the school auditorium, where hundreds of educators from across the state had gathered for the first Understanding Differences conference. The boy's hair had grown back beautifully, and his mother had once again braided it with care and love. This time, as he touched his braids, there was no fear, only pride. He sat in the front row between his parents, watching as teachers, administrators, and education experts shared stories and strategies for creating more inclusive schools. Mrs. Smith was scheduled to speak last. She had spent the past months working with the boys' Parents Foundation, sharing her story as a cautionary tale and a path to redemption. When she took the stage, her hands were steady, her voice clear. 6 months ago, I made a terrible mistake, she began. I hurt a child because of my own ignorance and bias. But that mistake led to something extraordinary, a movement for change that has touched schools across our state. The audience listened intently as she described her journey of learning and understanding. She talked about the cultural sensitivity training she'd received, the conversations she'd had with families from different backgrounds, and the deep personal work she'd done to confront her own prejudices. The boy's father, still serving as principal at Riverside Elementary, stood to share the changes he'd seen in his school. Our students don't just tolerate differences anymore, they celebrate them, he explained. Just last week, we had our first Cultural Heritage Day, where families shared their traditions, food, and stories. The same hallways where my son once felt shame now ring with questions, laughter, and genuine curiosity about different cultures. His wife, who had temporarily stepped back from her legal practice to focus on their foundation, spoke about the new policies being implemented in schools across the state. We've helped draft guidelines that protect students' cultural expressions, require cultural competency training for all school staff, and create clear accountability measures, she said. The boy himself had been invited to speak. As he walked to the podium, adjusted for his height, the audience fell silent. His voice was stronger now, more confident than that day in the school board meeting. When I was hurt, I thought it was the worst day of my life, he said simply. But my parents taught me that sometimes bad things happen so we can make things better. And we did make things better, not just for me, but for lots of kids. He told them about the friend who'd stood up for him that day, about the new students who asked him about his braids with respect instead of judgment, and about the younger kids who now felt safe wearing their hair in traditional styles. After the conference, as families mingled in the auditorium, a small girl approached the boy. Her hair was in intricate cornrows, and she smiled shyly. My teacher said I could do a presentation about my hair for class, she told him. She said you helped make that happen. The boy's parents watched as their son explained to the girl how important it was to be proud of who you are. Their foundation had already reached over 50 schools, with more requesting their program every week. The incident that had caused their son pain had sparked a movement that was changing lives. As they drove home that evening, the boy looked out the window at the setting sun. You know what? He said thoughtfully. I think we really did make things better. His parents exchanged proud glances in the rearview mirror. The story of a teacher's mistake and a brave boy's response had transformed into something much bigger. A lesson about understanding, respect, and the power of turning pain into positive change. In schools across the state, children were learning not just reading and math, but also the vital lesson that everyone's culture deserves respect and understanding. 3 weeks had passed since the incident, and Riverside Elementary looked different now. New posters celebrating diversity lined the hallways, and teachers attended weekly cultural awareness sessions after school. But the biggest changes weren't visible on the walls, they were happening in people's hearts and minds. The boy's story had gone viral, reaching millions of views across social media platforms. News outlets from across the country had picked up the story, turning their small town into the center of a national conversation about cultural awareness in schools. Each morning, the principal's office received letters and emails from parents, educators, and students sharing similar experiences and offering support. In the school library, a new section had been created featuring books about different cultures, hairstyles, and traditions. During lunch breaks, students could be seen reading these books together, asking questions and sharing stories about their own family's customs. The boy's head was healing well, thanks to regular medical care. His hair was starting to grow back, though the doctor said it would take time for it to return to its former length. What surprised everyone was how he handled the attention. Instead of hiding away, he became an unexpected ambassador for change. "Can you tell us about your braids?" a younger student asked him during lunch one day. The boy smiled and explained how his mother would spend hours carefully creating each braid, how it connected him to his heritage, and why it meant so much more than just a hairstyle. His parents had started a foundation called Understanding Differences, which worked with schools across the state to provide cultural sensitivity training. The boy's mother took time off from her legal practice to lead some of these sessions herself, sharing their story and helping educators understand the impact of their actions. One morning, the principal received an unexpected visitor. It was Mrs. Smith, who had spent the past weeks in intensive cultural sensitivity training and counseling. She had also been meeting with community leaders and families to better understand the harm she had caused. "I'd like to apologize to your son," she said quietly. "Not through the media, not through the school board, but personally. I've learned so much, and I'm deeply ashamed of what I did." The principal considered her request carefully. That evening, he discussed it with his wife and son. The boy thought for a long moment before saying, "I want to hear what she has to say." The meeting was arranged in the principal's office after school hours. Mrs. Smith sat nervously, hands folded in her lap, as the boy and his parents entered. The room was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Smith began, her voice trembling. "I didn't understand then, but I do now. What I did was wrong on so many levels. I violated your trust, your personal space, and your cultural identity. I've spent these weeks learning about the history and significance of black hairstyles, about the importance of cultural respect, and about my own biases that I didn't even know I had." The boy listened carefully, then asked, "Will you teach other teachers what you learned, so they don't make the same mistake?" Mrs. Smith looked surprised, then nodded eagerly. "Yes, I would like that very much. If you and your parents agree, I'd like to share my story as a warning and a lesson to others." The local Teachers Association had already asked Mrs. Smith to speak at their next conference about her experience and what she had learned. Her story would serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of cultural understanding and respect in education. As they left the office that day, the boy turned to his parents and said, "Remember when you said sometimes bad things happen so we can make things better? I think we did that." His parents hugged him, proud of their son's wisdom and forgiveness. The school board meeting room was packed to capacity the next morning. Parents, teachers, and community members filled every available seat, with more people standing along the walls. The buzz of whispered conversations filled the air, punctuated by the occasional sound of a news camera shutter. The boy and his parents sat in the front row. His bandaged head drew concerned looks from those around them, and several parents reached out to pat his shoulder supportively as they passed by. Local news crews had set up their cameras at the back of the room, their presence highlighting the significance of what was about to unfold. "The emergency meeting of the school board will now come to order," announced the board chairperson, her gavel cutting through the chatter. The room fell silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning. Mrs. Smith sat at a small table to the side, accompanied by a union representative. She looked different now, smaller somehow, her earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety. She kept her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, avoiding everyone's gaze. The boy's mother stood first, her legal pad in hand. "Before we begin," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I want to make something very clear. This isn't just about what happened to my son. This is about a systemic problem that needs addressing." She walked to the center of the room, turning to face the board members. "Yesterday, my son was physically assaulted by a teacher who decided that his cultural expression was a problem that needed to be fixed with industrial glue. Today, he has chemical burns on his scalp, and we had to cut away his braids that are part of his identity, his culture, his heritage." The room remained silent, but the tension was palpable. The boy's father, still in his role as principal, stood next to his wife. "As an educator and administrator, I've always believed in our school's potential to be a place of learning and growth for all students, but yesterday showed us how far we still have to go." From the back of the room, a parent raised her hand. "My daughter wears a hijab," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Could something like this happen to her too?" Before anyone could respond, another parent stood up. "My son has dreadlocks. He came home yesterday scared that a teacher might try to cut them off." More parents began to speak up, sharing their own children's fears and experiences. The board members exchanged glances, clearly realizing this was bigger than one isolated incident. Mrs. Smith finally looked up, tears in her eyes. I never meant to hurt anyone," she said softly. "I didn't understand." "That's exactly the problem," the boy's mother interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "You didn't understand, but you acted anyway. And that lack of understanding caused real harm." The board chairperson cleared her throat. "We've prepared a preliminary action plan," she announced. "It includes mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff, new policies regarding student bodily autonomy, and the formation of a diversity and inclusion committee." "That's a start," the boy's father said, "but it's not enough. We need ongoing education, regular community dialogues, and clear consequences for violations of these policies." The boy, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, suddenly stood up. The room fell silent as he walked to stand between his parents. His voice was small but clear as he addressed the board. "I don't want anyone else to feel like I did yesterday," he said simply. "It really hurt, and not just my head. It hurt here too." He pointed to his heart. His words, honest and direct, seemed to touch everyone in the room more deeply than any of the adult speeches. Several board members wiped their eyes, and even Mrs. Smith openly wept. The chairperson nodded solemnly. "Out of the mouths of babes," she said softly, then straightened in her chair. "We will take immediate action. Mrs. Smith will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Additionally, we will begin implementing the suggested changes immediately." As the meeting continued, local news cameras captured everything. This small-town story was about to become part of a larger national conversation about respect, understanding, and the need for change in American schools. The Pediatric Urgent Care Center was quiet except for the gentle hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional typing from the front desk. The boy sat on the examination table, paper crinkling beneath him as the doctor carefully examined his scalp. His parents stood nearby, their faces tense as they watched the examination unfold. "These are second-degree chemical burns," the doctor said, her voice carrying a mix of professional concern and personal outrage. "The craft glue has caused significant damage to the scalp tissue." She turned to the parents, her expression grave. "We'll need to document everything for your records." The boy's mother was already ahead of her, recording everything on her phone while taking notes. As a civil rights attorney, she knew exactly what they would need for what was coming next. The principal stood quietly, his usual commanding presence subdued by worry for his son. Will my hair grow back?" the boy asked in a small voice that made everyone's heart clench. The doctor gave him a gentle smile. "Yes, sweetheart, but we'll need to treat these burns first. And unfortunately, we'll have to cut away some of the affected hair to properly treat the scalp." She looked at his parents for permission. The mother nodded, but her hands were shaking slightly as she watched the doctor prepare the medical scissors. Her son's braids, which she had so lovingly done just days ago, would have to be cut away because of one teacher's thoughtless actions. While the doctor worked, the boy's phone kept buzzing with messages. Word had spread quickly through the school's parent network, and social media was already lighting up with outraged comments. Local news stations had gotten wind of the story and were requesting interviews. "The school board is calling an emergency meeting," the principal said quietly, looking at his phone. "They want us there tomorrow morning." His wife nodded, her attorney mind already formulating strategies. "Good," she replied, "because this isn't just about our son anymore. This is about every child who's ever been made to feel different, who's been touched without permission, who's been hurt because of someone else's ignorance." The boy winced as the doctor applied a cooling medication to his scalp. "Mom," he said suddenly, "remember when you told me sometimes bad things happen so we can make things better for other people?" His mother's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "That's right, baby. And that's exactly what we're going to do." As they left the urgent care center, cameras were already waiting outside. News vans had parked across the street, reporters ready with their microphones. The principal instinctively moved to shield his son from view. But the boy straightened his shoulders despite his bandaged head. "Dad," he said with a determination that made both his parents proud. "I want to talk to them. Maybe if people see what happened to me, they'll understand why it's wrong." His mother squeezed his hand. "Are you sure, sweetheart? You don't have to do this." The boy nodded. "Remember what you always say about speaking up?" he asked his father. The principal smiled, recognizing his own words coming back to him. "If we stay silent, nothing changes." As they approached the reporters, the family stood together, united in their purpose. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about sparking a conversation that was long overdue in their community. The boy's story would become a catalyst for change, starting with their small town but reaching far beyond. The camera lights clicked on, microphones extended, and the boy took a deep breath. He was scared, but he knew he wasn't alone. His parents stood beside him, ready to help him tell his story, not just about what had happened to him, but about what needed to change to make sure it never happened to anyone else. The door to the nurse's office opened slowly, and Principal Johnson stepped in, his usual warm smile replaced by a look of controlled concern. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Smith's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally horror, as she realized exactly who stood before her. "I came as soon as I heard," the principal said quietly, his eyes immediately going to his son. The boy managed a small smile, despite the discomfort he was still feeling. Mrs. Smith took an involuntary step backward, her hand flying to her mouth as the full reality of the situation hit her. "Principal Johnson, I didn't know," she stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. The vice principal shifted uncomfortably, while the nurse busied herself with reorganizing her supplies, trying to appear invisible in the increasingly tense room. "That he was my son." Principal Johnson's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Would it have made a difference, Mrs. Smith? Should it have made a difference?" He moved to stand beside his wife, who was still documenting the damage with her phone. "I was just trying to maintain classroom discipline," Mrs. Smith attempted to explain, her voice growing smaller with each word. "The boy, I mean your son, he wouldn't stop touching his hair, and I thought—" "You thought putting glue on a child's hair was an appropriate response." The boy's mother cut in, her voice sharp enough to make everyone wince. "Let me understand this clearly. You saw a black child touching his braids that are part of his cultural identity, and your solution was to pour glue on his head." The principal placed a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder before addressing Mrs. Smith directly. "As an educator with 15 years of experience, I have to ask, did you ever once consider asking him why he was touching his hair? Did you think about having a conversation with him or with his parents?" Mrs. Smith's face had gone pale. The braids were distracting the class. "No," the mother interrupted. "You were the one distracted. By your own prejudices, by your own assumptions, by your complete lack of cultural understanding." She turned to the vice principal. "I want to know what actions the school plans to take, and I want to know now." The vice principal cleared his throat. "We'll need to file an incident report and—" "An incident report?" Principal Johnson's calm facade finally cracked slightly. "This goes far beyond an incident report. This is about systemic issues that need to be addressed. My son has chemical burns on his scalp from industrial craft glue, and you're talking about paperwork." The boy, who had been quiet throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Dad, my head really hurts." His voice was small but drew everyone's attention immediately. The principal's expression softened as he looked at his son, then hardened again as he turned back to the adults in the room. "Mrs. Smith, please return to your classroom and gather your personal belongings. The vice principal will escort you to the office where we'll continue this discussion. Right now, my son needs medical attention." As Mrs. Smith was led out, looking shell-shocked, the mother turned to her husband. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "This can't be swept under the rug. Not this time." Principal Johnson nodded, picking up his son carefully to avoid touching the affected areas. "No, it's not over. But right now, let's get him to the doctor. Then we'll talk about the changes that need to happen here." As they left the nurse's office, other teachers and students watched from doorways, whispering among themselves. The boy held tight to his father's neck, and despite the pain, he felt safer knowing that finally, someone would have to listen. Something would have to change. The school nurse's office had never felt so tense. As she examined the young boy's scalp more closely, but concern grew with each passing moment. The craft glue had hardened, creating a thick, crusty layer that was pulling painfully at his skin. The boy sat quietly on the vinyl-covered bed, trying his best not to cry, but his trembling lower lip betrayed his brave facade. "Sweetie, your mom is on her way," the nurse said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. She had dealt with all sorts of playground accidents and classroom mishaps in her 15 years at Riverside Elementary, but this was different. This wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate action by a teacher who should have known better. Meanwhile, in the front office, the secretary was frantically trying to reach the vice principal. She knew this situation needed immediate attention, especially given who the boy's father was. But Principal Johnson was away at an important district meeting, and she wondered if anyone had thought to contact him yet. The boy's mother arrived like a storm cloud gathering force. She was dressed in a crisp business suit, having left an important meeting the moment she got the nurse's call. The clicking of her heels echoed down the hallway as she approached the nurse's office, each step carrying the weight of controlled anger. When she saw her son, her professional composure cracked slightly. "Oh, baby," she whispered, rushing to his side. The nurse watched as the mother's hands hovered over her son's hair, afraid to touch and cause more pain. The boy finally let his tears fall, safe in his mother's presence. "Who did this?" the mother asked, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room straighten up. When told it was Mrs. Smith, she closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath. "And where is she now?" The vice principal, who had just arrived, cleared his throat nervously. "She's still teaching her class. We thought it best to." "You thought it best to let her continue teaching after she assaulted my child?" The mother's words cut through the air like ice. "Get her in here. Now." As they waited, the mother documented everything with her phone, taking pictures while speaking softly to her son. The nurse noticed how she seemed to be gathering evidence with practiced precision and wondered if perhaps she worked in law. Mrs. Smith arrived looking confused, as if she'd been called to discuss a minor classroom incident. The moment she stepped into the nurse's office, the atmosphere changed. The mother stood up to her full height, but before she could speak, her son tugged at her sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "she doesn't know about Dad." The vice principal's face paled as he realized the full implications of what was about to unfold. Mrs. Smith still stood there, attempting to justify her actions with rehearsed phrases about classroom discipline and proper behavior. "I was only trying to help him focus," she explained, her voice carrying a patronizing tone that made the mother's eyes narrow. "These children need to learn that there are certain standards of appearance that—" She never finished her sentence because at that moment, the door opened again. The boy's mother smiled for the first time since arriving, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested the real storm was about to begin. What Mrs. Smith didn't know was that her educational career was about to change forever, and the next person walking through that door would make her realize just how badly she had misjudged the situation. The tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife as footsteps approached down the hallway. The morning sun peeked through the classroom windows of Riverside Elementary as a young boy sat at his desk, occasionally touching his freshly braided hair. His mother had spent the whole weekend carefully styling it, making sure each braid was perfect. The boy couldn't help but smile, remembering how his mom had played his favorite cartoon while working on his hair to keep him from fidgeting too much. Mrs. Smith, the new fourth-grade teacher, watched the boy from her desk with growing irritation. She had only been at the school for 3 weeks, and everything about this particular student seemed to challenge her old-fashioned views of how students should look and behave in class. "Stop playing with your hair and pay attention," she called out for the 3rd time that morning. The boy quickly dropped his hands to his lap, but his fingers still itched to touch the neat rows of braids. They were still new and a bit tight, a feeling he wasn't quite used to yet. During art class, while the students worked on their paper mache projects, Mrs. Smith noticed the boy touching his braids again. Something in her snapped. She walked to the supply cabinet, grabbed a bottle of craft glue, and approached his desk with what she thought was helpful intention. "Let me help you keep those braids in place," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Before the boy could protest or move away, she had squeezed glue onto her hands and started patting it onto his hair. The other kids in class watched in shocked silence, some with their mouths hanging open, others exchanging worried glances. "There," Mrs. Smith said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Now you won't be distracted anymore." She walked back to her desk, completely unaware that she had just made the biggest mistake of her teaching career. The boy sat frozen in his chair, feeling the cold glue seeping into his scalp, too shocked and scared to speak up. His best friend, sitting next to him, quickly scribbled a note, "Are you okay?" The boy could only shake his head slightly, tears starting to form in his eyes. The glue was beginning to dry, making his scalp feel tight and uncomfortable. What would his mom say? And his dad, if only Mrs. Smith knew who his father was. As the morning wore on, the discomfort turned to pain. The boy tried to raise his hand to ask to go to the nurse's office, but Mrs. Smith ignored him. It wasn't until his friend noticed him wincing and spoke up that anyone paid attention to his distress. "Mrs. Smith," his friend called out bravely, "I think something's wrong. His head is hurting really bad." The school nurse's eyes went wide when she saw what had happened. She immediately reached for the phone, knowing this situation was far beyond her usual band-aids and ice packs. As she dialed the number listed in the boy's emergency contacts, she had no idea she was about to set off a chain of events that would change the entire school. The boy sat quietly in the nurse's office, trying to be brave despite the burning sensation on his scalp. He knew his mom would be there soon, and somehow that thought made him feel both better and more worried at the same time. His dad was at a big meeting today, but soon everyone would know exactly who the boy's father was, including Mrs. Smith. Little did Mrs. Smith know, but her actions that morning would not only jeopardize her teaching career, but also spark a conversation that would reach far beyond the walls of Riverside Elementary. As the nurse held an ice pack to the boy's head, the clock ticked closer to a confrontation that would change everything.